to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with another huge week of World War III analysis here in the United States. Planes are literally falling out of the sky. We have major updates going on in the Levant with Israel as the hostage exchanges and the ceasefire in Gaza continue tenuously, and we even have some updates on how that's likely going to be falling apart. We have new strikes from new groups in Syria on Israel. We have major updates in Lebanon as Israel seems to want to stay in Lebanon indefinitely. News out of the West Bank as Israel continues their operations there, and Trump makes new announcements about how Palestinians are going to be displaced to Egypt and Jordan. Major updates from the Russia-Ukraine front, things in Kursk, things in Donetsk as Russians get closer and closer to Pokrovsk. We're then obviously also going to get into some of this election news as the German elections creep closer and, vote attempts to conjoin with the CDU on anti-immigrant laws have failed with Merkel's intervention. We're going to talk about all of this. Huge new World War fronts in Africa as Rwanda and the DRC continue to fight, as well as some major church news updates. So big show this week. Going to be touching on all of that and more. Dimitri, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It's really good to be here this week. A lot to discuss, a lot of tragic news as well as certain exciting news stories, which I think it'll be important to cover because it seems like with every week, our sort of stories and the different fronts of the world keep expanding. It's just almost as if we have to discuss multiple areas around the globe all at once. So yeah, it's definitely been a busy few days.
No, definitely. There's stuff going on in Serbia, protests there, Georgian updates, all sorts of smaller stories we're going to touch on, as well as a host of based Lukashenko moments. We haven't talked a lot about those recently, so it's good to be back to true World War Now form. But before we dive into the analysis, I have to remind everybody, please like the episodes. We actually reminded people to like the episode on our previous one. It became one of our most liked episodes. So that should be happening every time. So please, if you're listening to this on Substack, on YouTube, wherever you may be, Apple Podcasts, Spotify as well, X, please like and share the video. It really helps us on whatever algorithm we may be working with, especially here on Substack. Please like the videos, especially if you're a paid subscriber, because you're already paying to support. Why not also boost us in the algorithm and make more World War Now enjoyers, as it were, so more people can listen to the content. So please do that. And be sure to check out this week's Ether Hour with Joseph Jordan, Eric Stryker. Really great conversation on the Third World War, multipolarity, Zog, nationalist economics, a whole host of other really fascinating subjects. Russia, Ukraine, Russia versus Turkey, Israel, Gaza, Israel versus Syria, all sorts of these sorts of things. So check that out. It's obviously all linked below, and become a paying subscriber to hear the episode in full and get access to all of our incredible Ether Hour discussions, at this point 65 plus episodes. So please do that, all linked below. worldwarnow.substack.com, worldwarnow.co. Again, linked down below our latest Ether Hour episode. But with all of that, we got to dive right in here. Probably just going to start with all this crazy news coming out of the United States just a few days after the huge crash, the helicopter collision with the passenger plane in DC, Ronald Reagan Airport. It was a Army helicopter, a Black Hawk that collided with an American Airlines flight that was coming from Kansas, killing all 67 people on board. Both of the aircrafts, of course. Nobody survived. All of the bodies are being fished out of the icy Potomac River at this point here in late January. It's really a horrible tragedy. I know there were well-known Russian and United States figure skaters on the American Airlines flight, and then the soldiers that were flying the Army helicopter also have passed away. So keep all of them in your prayers. Pray for their repose. But of course, the conversation on why this happened has been raging. People are blaming DEI. There's rumors that one of the pilots is a transgender of some capacity, which would be, I don't even know what to say to that. But there's also conspiracies. Why did this happen? Where was this thing taking off from? I was seeing some pretty substantial evidence that it took off from a private property owned by the Saudi embassy that isn't visible on Google Maps, Google Street View, and these sorts of things, and that it does have a big helicopter pad. So some were saying that had something to do with it and that this was a inside job. And then as everybody's still analyzing this, we have this, just as the night we were recording this big plane crash in Philadelphia, which was supposedly a medical evacuation sort of ambulance plane. All 6 people on board, multiple doctors, nurses, and then the patient and the pilots. They all died. The footage is crazy. It's in the middle of a residential area in Philadelphia. A lot of people thought it looked like a missile at first, which frankly it did. And the explosion is huge. I think the death toll might be more than 6 at this point because there were people on the ground that appeared to have been engulfed in flames. The emergency services seem to be having a very delayed response. So really crazy stuff happening in the United States. I've heard nothing I could point to substantially, but in my discussions with elders and those on Mount Athos and other places about prophecies and what's going to go on in America. I mean, planes falling out of the sky. I've heard this language used before, and this is very much a disaster movie, post-apocalyptic or rather apocalyptic type of happening. Now, people are going to be afraid to go on airplanes. It seems that with all the Boeing technology stuff that we've discussed in the past, as well as, of course, the DEI stuff, specifically in air traffic control and pilots, I mean, it's really getting less safe to fly than perhaps it used to be, which is very unfortunate. And we've talked a lot about Malaysian flights that disappeared. We've talked a lot about the flights that got shot down over Donetsk in 2014 and onwards at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. So these sorts of airline disasters, this one, of course, in DC is the worst United States airline disaster since 9/11. And it appears that these things obviously can force policy changes, but sometimes these things, as could be seen in Donetsk and other war zones, can lead to real serious international incidents. And again, if Boeing is behind a lot of these planes, their sales are going to go down, and that's going to affect the U.S. economy, which is something that's also, we're going to be discussing this week as Trump begins to level these new tariffs, threatening 25% tariffs on all goods from Canada and Mexico, threatening tariffs on these Taiwanese products. We talk about that in our episode with Eric Stryker, tariffs on China, threatening tariffs on the EU even. So the economic warfare is really, really going down. We have the whole AI situation with China. We're going to maybe touch on that in a second, but Trump's trade war seems to be coinciding with all of these plane disasters. We also had other plane news when Trump was talking about deporting all of these Colombian illegal immigrants back to Colombia. Colombia immediately said this is not going to be happening, and they rejected it. And then Trump initiated basically a 30-minute trade war where he put massive tariffs on Colombian goods, and the Colombians immediately backed off. The Colombian president immediately said, "Oh, our bad, we'll do it. And we'll also send our own presidential plane to help facilitate the deportation of these illegal Colombian migrants." But then, of course, this had political consequences, and the Colombian president or prime minister, his coalition is, I think, collapsing at home. So it was very impressive to see Trump, just utilize the full weight of America's economic might to simply get what we want in this basic situation, like deporting illegal immigrants, not allowing this puny country to stand up to us and, allow their citizens to continue to break our laws, which was very unfortunate. But if you have anything to say about that, Dimitri, obviously we have a whole bunch of other Trump news. Trump talked about how he's going to punish BRICS countries for if they attempt to make a new currency. We also had the order to defund a lot of the federal grants that were going to all sorts of NGOs and other groups overseas, but that got rescinded after much controversy. This is from MSN. It says the Trump administration rescinded a memo describing a freeze Wednesday on federal grants and loans after setting off a firestorm in Congress and at least 2 lawsuits disputing who controls spending priorities, according to White House Press Secretary Caroline Levitt. And for those that don't know, technically, Congress controls the power of the purse, but obviously the executive branch does have allocating powers. So major shakeups happening here in DC. We also even have the appointments of Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., Kash Patel, all sorts of things going on, Dimitri. So what are your thoughts on the craziness going on, specifically in DC, plane crashes, new laws, all sorts of stuff?
No, absolutely. It's been a crazy time. We're only 1 month in, right? We're right on the edge of February here. Of course, Friday, 31st of January, and it's already been an insane January in terms of foreign policy, domestic policy, the inauguration. We had mass shootings all across the US from various people, some claiming to be far right, others, of course, of the more sort of left-leaning type. Of course, there's been a lot of really big talk, a lot of powerful tweets on Truth Social by Donald J. Trump. I think the most eccentric was this tweet just a day ago regarding the BRICS tariffs, right? Even hypothetically speaking, Trump essentially stated he'll place very intense tariffs on all of the BRICS member countries, including, of course, the founding 5 BRICS countries. That's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And if you can imagine, that's, the vast majority of the globe, essentially. And if they adopt a BRICS-only currency and essentially move away from the US dollar, essentially moving away from the fiat dollar-controlled petrodollar system, which I think is in the interest of all these nations, and probably why Saudi Arabia, which is one of the nations which, of course, contributed to the petrodollar dominance, has been essentially kind of sidelining away from the BRICS currency and even joining BRICS as a member state. So there's a lot to consider there. And look, we've been quite skeptical, Conrad, even when we discussed with Gennady, our sort of economics expert on episode 55 of the 8th Hour, which came out in November last year. Very intense sort of 2.5 hour discussion on BRICS, Russian economics. And we talked about the potential of a BRICS coin or a BRICS alternative currency coming out. And even Gennady agreed that potentially it's not on the cards in the near future. But here we have Trump almost putting this strong emphasis that America will not be supportive of a alternative BRICS currency being made, as if him and his administration is scared of that. And why would you fear a phantom or a ghost, which is not going to sort of materialize itself into reality? So it does essentially make us think, Conrad, very deeply about the fact that perhaps there is a potential, maybe certain spy rings or certain espionage information which Trump and his administration received about the BRICS countries actually preparing for this alternative fiat system in the near future. So that's quite an interesting revelation that we have from his Truth Social post. And I think naturally, of course, the risk of the massive tariffs being placed on all the BRICS countries are, of course, unrealistic. That would crash the US economy. Who knows what exactly would do it for the globe? It would go into a recession. There's all kinds of massive economic risks, which I think even Donald J. Trump, with all his bravado, will not take. And of course, the tragedy regarding the Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopter. What can I say? I mean, there's a lot of room for conspiratorial discussions here. Frankly, of course, the DEI hiring of potentially the pilot, the co-pilot, maybe some of the soldiers on board. There's all kinds of really deep discourse. And most likely, I mean, given the fact that over the last few years, there's been really strange accidents, including, remember that boat that kind of on autopilot crashed into the bridge, all kinds of bizarre plane crashes all around the world, including, of course, in 2023, the Prigozhin aircraft, which crashed over the Tverskaya Oblast north of Moscow on the 24th of August, when, again, there's no black box, there's no real record of what happened there. And that was essentially an assassination of the passengers. And this raises a question. Who were the passengers on that plane, the 64 people who died? Was there any figures of interest, perhaps, that needed to, say, go away quietly or disappear in a certain tragic accident? Again, lots of very interesting discourse. But of course, if anyone's interested in looking into the history of Black Hawk helicopters generally, I think it does have a pretty deep tie to the World War Now show. Just to search up, like, of course, it was a Sikorsky helicopter. So the creator of one of the inventors of the helicopter, Sikorsky, was a member of ROKOR. Igor Sikorsky moved to the United States after the Russian Revolution. He was an Orthodox Christian, a member of ROKOR, a Russian patriot, definitely. And his father, actually, Professor Ivan Sikorsky, was a patriotic Kievan Russian. So he lived in Kiev, and he was actually an expert witness as one of the top Russian psychologists on the Belarus trial regarding the ritual murder of Andrei Yushchinsky in Kiev. So the 1913, one of the most famous trials in late Russian imperial history, worth searching up. Again, it ties, of course, to Talmudic ritual murder. So very interesting how this Black Hawk helicopter story, it almost ticks all the boxes for a typical conspiratorial World War Now story. But again, the tragedy of over 67, 68 people dying, of course, kind of does paint this into a very sort of dark light. And who knows, maybe I did hear some stories and hypothetical opinions, Conrad, that potentially the helicopter would have been controlled perhaps from a distance. Maybe it was some sort of autopilot remote control, or some sort of AI has guided the helicopter inadvertently into the flight path of the larger aircraft. So, and I have my doubts as to if we'll ever even find out the truth, right? I get that there's confidentiality sort of policies regarding the revelation of the names of the victims, or perhaps even blame and fault. But the American public, I think, is very untrusting towards its own government. And again, the large bureaucracy guiding the United States. So the US is turning from a high trust society into a very low trust, unsafe environment. And a lot of people are really feeling the pressure, I think, culturally and now politically speaking. It's, as you said, it feels very unsafe to fly, to travel, to visit certain suburbs and areas and cities around even the United States, which is a first world, rich, wealthy, technologically gifted country. So a lot of things are changing, that's for sure.
No, it's very true. And, the ether is tearing, as it were. Things are just getting crazier. Things are kind of accelerating to the point where eventually, when people are called to arms in a third world war, or major infrastructure fails, or perhaps even major natural disasters occur, not to say that it won't catch people off guard, but it will sort of seem like the next, I think, progression of just what is happening, because things are simply getting crazy. And you can chalk that up to all sorts of things: the lack of repentance, all sorts of other geopolitical machinations of certain people, perhaps controlled demolition of certain economies to build something up anew, even more friendly to Zog and the Jewish world order. There's all sorts of angles we could take this from. But before we move away from the situation in D.C. with Trump, he did sign his first actual piece of legislation, which was the Laken-Riley Act, which requires the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to detain illegal immigrants who admit to or are charged with convicted and are convicted of theft-related crimes, assaulting a police officer, or a crime that results in the death or serious bodily injury of somebody like drunk driving, which again, being in the country illegally should be enough to have your ass immediately deported. Like you get arrested and you are then immediately put into Mexico or wherever you came from. This is good that if somebody, of course, does a horrible crime like kills somebody or is drinking and driving or steals something, then they immediately get deported. This obviously makes sense. So I think it's appropriate that this was one of the first things that Trump signed. Of course, the bill was introduced and is named after Laken Riley, who was a nursing student that was murdered by a Venezuelan illegal immigrant who had previously been cited for shoplifting, who, again, if he had just been deported like he should have when he first got caught for shoplifting, he wouldn't have been able to kill a lovely American citizen. So very good to see that. And then the other good news are it seems that all three of the latest Trump cabinet appointments, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and Kash Patel, they seem that they will all make it forward. Of course, Kash Patel is getting grilled for his 8 appearances on the Stu Peters show, of which I have appeared on before. And of course, in later years, Stu has come out fully against Jewish power. So that's not something that people in Congress are going to appreciate. RFK Jr. is getting pressed on all of his vaccine stances and all these other things, which, again, he did say Operation Warp Speed was amazing, which I don't know why you need to say that, man. Your entire brand is being anti-vax, but I guess you want to get approved, you want to make it through the process. So, perhaps you just come down moderate on certain positions, but obviously know the truth deep down. And then Tulsi Gabbard, she is, in many ways, her anti-war stance is possibly the least controversial of all of these people. But as far as going against the establishment, people view her, remember when Barry Weiss on Joe Rogan called her an Assad toady, and then Joe Rogan pushed back on that. What does that mean? And she freaked out. She's like, oh, I don't know. It's she just is terrible and something hates Israel, blah, blah, blah. So it's going to be good that all these people get in. However, all of them are moderating. Kash Patel saying apparently he doesn't agree with all of the pardons Trump gave on January 6th. RFK supporting Operation Warp Speed. Tulsi Gabbard, like I said, she might be bringing in a sort of new facade to what will ultimately be the Greater Israel Project and confronting Iran with people thinking, oh, no, we're not actually doing that because we have these anti-war people in there. And of course, Trump's first visit with a foreign dignitary is approaching Tuesday, February 4th. He will be visiting Benjamin Netanyahu, the genocider-in-chief who has been in power 30 plus years in Israel, dutifully executing the Greater Israel Project on behalf of Rebbe Menachem Mendel Schneerson, who we've all seen the video of him telling Netanyahu what to do, giving him these dollars and all these sorts of things. But the situation in Israel is, we'll have a whole section about that here next, but Trump is already talking about sending the Palestinians to Egypt and Jordan, talking about allowing Israeli occupation in Gaza and in the West Bank. Gazans are, of course, trying to return to their homes right now. Meanwhile, Israel is, storming the West Bank, driving 20,000 plus Palestinians out of Jenin. And we have people like Tom Cotton and other United States senators putting forward bills in the Senate to recognize the West Bank as officially called Judea and Samaria. And then, of course, we already know that sanctions were removed on the most violent and aggressive settlers in that region. And of course, Smotrich already controls huge swaths of it, and its incorporation into Israel is openly discussed in the Knesset. So, as we said before, Miriam Adelson's $100 million to Trump came with what was the price tag for that money? It was West Bank annexation, and it appears that within the first few months of the Trump administration, that very well may come to pass, all while we see disputes in Gaza. We're going to get into all of that in a second. But again, Trump is very much making it clear that Greater Israel is something possible that he will oversee. And the last stuff, of course, comes the Greenland and the Panama Canal stuff. Greenland, Trump and his new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, have stated that they want Greenland, that it's a very serious endeavor, that they're going to be pursuing a number of options there. But the Panama Canal has come under more and more discussion recently. And this is from CIG on Telegram. It says Secretary of State Marco Rubio is carefully yet not openly messaging here that the U.S. knows when and how the Chinese plan to blow up the Panama Canal locks. Until 1994, U.S. Army infantry battalions were based at both ends of the canal, right besides the locks, Fort Davis and Fort Clayton. And as Panama abolished its military in 1990, there's now just a few policemen guarding the canal's locks. Once China attacks Taiwan, Chinese troops currently pretending to dock workers at the Chinese-operated ports in Panama will destroy the canal's locks and prevent the U.S. Atlantic Fleet from crossing into the Pacific, while the Suez Canal will be blocked by a Chinese container ship getting stuck. Rubio's first foreign trip was to Panama to explain to President Jose Raul Molino the reason the U.S. will no longer ignore the Chinese presence in Panama. So this idea that somehow China will be able to block the Panama Canal, that their continued domination of it economically will have a military application when potentially they make a move in the South Pacific, that's obviously being seeded in the mind of people here, so they will support full U.S. reclamation of the Panama Canal, which we know the treaty was signed by Jimmy Carter in the 70s, and then in 1999, that was when full ownership was transferred over to the Panama Canal, which again, I really don't care that much about this. I think it would probably be good for the U.S. to control it. It'd probably save us money. But at the same time, again, it's just another kind of imposition of U.S. imperial goals on these other countries that, again, when Trump isn't in charge and somebody that's much more interested in a sort of global homo empire, these kinds of things aren't necessarily going to seem as good. But again, Trump's huge tariffs, Trump's Greenland play, this, the Laken Riley Act, the stuff at the border, it's all nationalist and sovereigntist. And I'm not hating Trump for it at all. When you tie it into the unfortunate levels of pro-Israel statements and how much Israel is getting their way, it appears that America getting stronger, while as an American, it does benefit me in some ways. What's the reason for it? What's its actual purpose that it's being built up for? And I fear that is a direct confrontation with Iran in the Middle East, potential confrontations with China after that in the Pacific, and again, still potential confrontations with Russia, with our NATO allies, even Turkey, all across the European continent and the Eastern Mediterranean. So all these things are on our minds here at World War Now. If you have any comments on that situation, I really thought that hypothesis on how China could block the Panama and Suez canals when they attack Taiwan, that makes a lot of sense. Of course, I do still believe that peaceful reunification on that front is very likely, but I'd love your thoughts there before we move to the Middle East.
Regarding the Panama Canal, I think if you compare the two sort of potential annexations the US can make in the near future, I would say the Greenland annexation would be a lot more pro-Zog and a lot more negative in the long term. I think even for a post-Trump presidency, and it would perhaps impact world affairs in a lot more negative light than, say, the Panama Canal, which frankly, I sort of agree with Trump and his administration. It does belong to the American people. It was American workers, American taxpayer dollars which built it. And frankly, Panama's not really a real country, right? Frankly, it's just essentially 4.5 million native peoples with no real identity.
I mean, the U.S. supported Panamanian independence from Colombia for the purpose of building the Panama Canal.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. And I would even say it was most likely like a Jimmy Carter-ish sort of post-Vietnam hippie-esque foreign policy, like the post-colonial drive, which even gave Panama its independence. I think in some ways today, it's somewhat misconstrued. This foreign policy, the view of America has definitely changed. And even from an American perspective, definitely some sort of sovereign claim over at least the Panama Canal, or some sort of American strong presence there, as opposed to maybe a Chinese CHICOM presence, I think would be preferable. Whereas with Greenland, you have all kinds of bizarre strings attached to, of course, NATO, of course, a future war with Russia, etc. The implications are a lot more dire rather than just a canal, which was used primarily for, of course, global trade, similar to the Suez Canal, which in some ways the Suez Canal is a lot more important in terms of exactly what happens there. But definitely notice how the US aid, of course, continues to flow into Egypt, Israel. The Suez Canal is secure. The Houthis are, of course, at peace now, but Trump will be relisting the Houthis as a terrorist organization shortly, sometime in the near future. And of course, the Houthis have released 153 hostages from I believe, the Galaxy ship, which they seized. So the Houthis are happy to have a temporary ceasefire as long as the Gaza massacre has stopped. And so we have this interesting Trump being the opener of ways in a way, right? He's the unlocker of the waterways. He's securing global trade in terms of allowing the world to prosper and not go into this recession, which a lot of people have been speaking about. And essentially, the world has been preparing for since at least the 2007, 2008 global financial crisis. Trump will be putting this recession off by allowing the spice to flow through the waterways. So that's quite an interesting thing. But of course, the Panama president, as you mentioned, Jose Raul Molino, has made it very clear to Marco Rubio. He said, look, the Panama sovereignty situation is sealed. The canal belongs to our nation. We're not going to debate or argue over that. But we'll see how he reacts maybe when a certain tariff is placed on his country, similar to, of course, the Colombia president. He began to sing a very different song when the risk of a 25% tariff was threatened and even signed into brief action over a few hours by Donald J. Trump via executive order. So very sort of interesting way, the way these countries depend, of course, and rely on US foreign aid, which again, it's interesting because foreign aid right now is being audited quite heavily by the Trump administration. There's a lot of Russian, I would say not Russian, but post-Russian liberal and Ukrainian YouTubers and content creators online, even Belarusian, so Svetlana Tikhanovskaya types who tried to run against Lukashenko in this election, complaining because there are NGOs who were funding them, these Soros-backed groups that were receiving US grants, etc., through these NGOs, of course, backed by the Biden administration, are now not receiving the same money. And some are completely cut off from funding because of the Trump administration auditing these foreign aid monies. And so a lot of them are making YouTube videos stating that the US is surrendering Ukraine and, of course, not funding some of these troll groups online and all these various YouTube content creators who are, of course, hating on Russia, creating all this divisive content and dividing the Russian and Ukrainian people further. So I would say the Trump administration in some ways is sabotaging that sort of pro-Ukrainian, pro-Zog movement around the world, but maybe even unintentionally so, in order to blame the Democrats for wasting and spending money. So I think that's quite interesting. But, in relation to the Middle East and foreign policy, one of the countries which, of course, the US has continued to paint as this potential enemy for the future, Iran, the Iranian foreign minister, Araglichu, tells Al Jazeera that Iran will immediately and decisively react to any US or Israeli attack against its nuclear sites. Notice he doesn't state the nuclear sites are militarized in any way, simply that these Iranian nuclear sites exist and that they're a key target which Israel and the US are looking at. So the Iranian foreign minister is already aware, and Iran, the leadership, the cabinet, is aware that US and Israel are still looking in a very predator-like fashion at these Iranian nuclear development areas and that they're the main target for any futuristic aggression. And so he's almost like taking and putting Iran into this virtuous defensive position, stating that, look, we're in the defensive, we're simply looking to expand our nuclear energy capacity, and these aggressive countries, the United States, Zionist Israel, are going to strike against us in the near future. And so he's warning the world in a way, almost, I'm not sure what it's worth, however, because again, Russia was posturing itself as the defender of Donetsk, Lugansk, but as soon as the 24th of February 2022 occurred, Russia was still painted as the aggressor. So whatever happens, even if Israel strikes the nuclear facilities tomorrow, Conrad, somehow the media around the world will still paint Iran as the aggressor, just because this is how the MSM works, unfortunately.
No, and the fact that Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, is saying that proves that that's the consensus in Iran, because he ultimately would prefer to normalize. I think with a lot of Western countries, he's part of the reformist group, but the fact that everybody knows that if there is this strike on Iran's nuclear capabilities, they have to say this kind of stuff because that's their only leverage with the West is the nuclear thing, and their only attempt to get back in some kind of contact with America and some kind of agreements on paper is to come back to the nuclear deal, which allows Iran to demand all sorts of sanctions relief and other necessities that they could extract geopolitically from the people that hold the whip hand over them, which is, of course, Zog and the American golem. But you mentioned, of course, EU officials have also been saying that they believe within the first few months and weeks of the Trump administration, Israel will strike Iran's nuclear capabilities, and all sorts of Israeli military and political leaders openly talk about doing this. So any day, as Elder Theodore of Crete said, that you'll be drinking your coffee one morning and you will see that the Jews struck the Persians' nuclear facilities, and then things are going to heat up very quickly from there. So you can always keep that in mind. And this is very recently here from Israel Channel 12. They said that Netanyahu is holding security discussions today on the possibility of resuming fighting in Gaza if the ceasefire agreement collapses. Of course, we're seeing all of these hostages be released. The Israelis that were being held by Hamas are being released, and they all look very fit and that they were cared for. Meanwhile, the Palestinians being released from Israel are somehow still covered in dust and emaciated and starved, and it's horrible. And many of those people being released have been in Israeli custody since they were 12, 13, 14 years old and are now fully grown adults. So it just shows the level of Jewish control over the media, how everybody, so many people, conservatives, every Jew is posting like, they're home, it's amazing, we've all been so worried about all these people. It's like, bro, like your country is doing this to, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians all the time, and now just 100 people are getting held as hostages, and you're acting as if the war, like, it's just the way they demand and expect the world to be like, wow, you're right. Like, they really think the world also believes that, like, Jewish blood is worth way more than the blood of Goyim. They're like, yes, like, we understand that these other prisoners are being held, but we're Jewish. And because we're the chosen people, you should also be excited that one of the tribe has been returned. And it's like, okay. So it's really crazy to see the kind of two sides of this coin here. But despite all of these exchanges taking place, we have quotes from Smotrich talking to the Jerusalem Post. He says, I am convinced that Israel will return to battle soon after the end of the first stage in early March. The Palestinian Arabs are the ones standing in the way of development and prosperity in the regions. They will not have a state ever. And he says, if the second stage of the deal includes ending the war without achieving its goals, I will bring down the government. So we know Ben-Gvir and his radical Jewish party left Netanyahu's government. And if Smotrich does the same, then there might have to be elections and Netanyahu will no longer be in power. So he really has a lot of power. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing the West Bank operation, because he himself has operational control over the West Bank. And right now, like I said, 20,000 Palestinians driven out of Jenin, major operations going on there. The Palestinian Authority also helping the Israelis as Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad factions that have had enough of the rule by Shabbos Goy that's going on over there. They finally started to rise up en masse, and there are real firefights going on there. But the other big news, again, regarding Gaza, as more and more Gazans, specifically in the north, return home to completely flattened and destroyed homes and neighborhoods. The Rafah crossing down with Egypt in the south of Gaza is reopening today on the 31st. And this is, a lot of people are giving a lot of analysis on this. And of course, one of the big deals that came with the ceasefire agreement is that Hamas injured soldiers are going to be able to go through the Rafah Strip, I think, into Egypt and other places and have medical treatment and then return to the Gaza Strip, which again, I'm sure people like Smotrich are painting as, this is surrender. This is what we were talking about when we said that this whole ceasefire deal is bad for Israel. But one of the big pieces of news, and this is from Bella Macta, it says, UG Solutions, a small US-based security company, will man a checkpoint at the intersection of the Netzarim corridor and Salah al-Din Street with Egyptian security personnel. The company is hiring about 100 former US Special Forces officers to man a checkpoint in Gaza during a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. Founded in 2023, UG Solutions, a low-profile security company based in Davidson, North Carolina, is offering the veterans a starting salary of $1,100 per day and a down payment of $10,000. According to a company spokesperson, the private security personnel will work at a critical checkpoint in the interior of Gaza. So that's hundreds of U.S. military contractors right there on the ground in Gaza, working with Egypt, who we know are a proxy of the U.S. and Israel at this point. Trump has been talking with al-Sisi and the Hashemite king of Jordan again about taking more and more Gazans and Palestinians into their borders, and I think effectively giving Israel the green light to resettle some of these areas and open up the door to annexation. So I'd love your thoughts on everything going on in Gaza and Israel right now.
Yeah, no, it's looking quite intense. I would just say that, for those looking at some of the footage of released Palestinian prisoners, etc., looking very emancipated, literally as if they're coming out of gulags, right? Like Soviet concentration camps with scars on their bodies and what appear to be injection sites, all over their stomach, arms, etc. And of course, we know what kind of injections of troop serums, all kinds of other torture liquids, etc., being injected into these people. We hear about that, of course, when we read about it in the WikiLeaks released by Julian Assange, etc., spread out online from American black sites. These Israeli torture techniques are, of course, trained and shared by the CIA. And what's interesting is that you look at these prisoners and you consider that they were arrested not after October 7th, but definitely years before. So like the example of the young man arrested 6 years ago, and now he's been detained, tortured, etc. His brain is probably completely fried. He's been mind controlled, and now he has to return to his family entirely broken. And you just consider that and look at the hypothetical of Orthodox Christians returning to their homes after years, at least 3 years plus, of Ukrainian detention. And some Orthodox Christians have been sitting in Ukrainian prisons for over 10 years now, since 2014, since the Maidan has taken place. And they would have been tortured by similar methods because we know IDF, Mossad, CIA specialists have been working with the Ukrainians very closely, at least over the last decade. Generally speaking, we have been seeing stories of rabbis traveling back and forth. We've seen Israeli commandos in 2014 fighting in the Donbass for Poroshenko and his regime. So there's a lot of really interesting similarities I think we'll see in the near future. So we should have at least some empathy and sympathy for those poor Palestinians coming back after years of being mistreated in these Israeli, what can only be called war crime camps at this point, similar to, of course, Guantanamo Bay in the Caribbean. So this is incredibly sad and concerning, and definitely you can tell the comparison between, of course, the Israeli hostages being released, all plump, happy, some of them, of course, probably traumatized, and we understand, of course, that always comes with a certain level of psychological damage, but it's not even comparable, Conrad, to that, those people being released by the Israeli IDF and the Israeli government. So definitely we see on whose side I think God is, especially when you look at how prisoners are being treated. I think it's very evident, and we shouldn't just discount some of these prisoners being released as saying, oh, well, they're just Sunni Muslims, they must have been radicals, when Orthodox Christian prisoners are probably treated the same, if not worse, in Ukrainian POW and other black sites all over Ukraine. It's not just the so-called science labs which Russia is seeking to liberate across Ukraine, and some of these prisons which have held very patriotic Orthodox Christians for, I would say, years now, close to a decade. So lots of very concerning news. And now that Gaza is somewhat resolved and they're still trading hostages in a somewhat organized fashion, we see this general development across the Middle East. Like everyone is moving towards peace. There's this false security sort of feeling that even, with the disbandment of HDS officially by al-Jolani in Syria, there's this call for general peace in Lebanon. Naturally, in Lebanon, we say that there will be a peace, but since November until now, there's been at least 85 dead Lebanese people from Israeli bombardment. So there's still fighting happening in southern Lebanon, but it has been drastically reduced, probably by at least 95%. So there's still bombardment by Israelis, but it's gradually going down in severity. And I think Hezbollah is still trying to cooperate with the Lebanese military in order to de-escalate the situation south of the Litani River. So that's generally the news coming out of that area. And I say this because just this week, there's been at least 5 Lebanese people killed during Israeli bombardments of allegedly Hezbollah arms depots, right? So similar claims to them bombing Syrian civilian targets all over the country since October 7th. But moving on to Syria, Conrad, I think this is probably some of the most shocking stories that HDS has been officially disbanded. All the official leaders of HDS, including al-Jolani himself, who now goes under Ahmed al-Sharaa, of course his official sort of birth name, have been integrated into the official Syrian new government. So sort of the oppositionary government have become the mainstream. HDS, being a terroristic sort of paramilitary organization, has been reduced to non-existence by their own leader. And so now, officially, there's no real reason for Russia even to delist, say, HDS from the terror list, or even the United States or any other country which still had HDS listed as a terrorist organization, because it simply ceased to exist. Notice almost like a rebranding of sorts of a corporation after it becomes default or liquidates itself. So it's pretty clever. It's just rebranding from Al-Qaeda to HDS, and then you just kind of get taken off the list automatically. And of course, the members now of the Sharia government of Syria are, of course, very questionable in terms of their qualifications, are also making these insane demands in a foreign policy sense. The craziest demand we've heard of this week was that they would like Russia to extradite Dr. Bashar al-Assad, the former president of Syria, to Damascus in order for him to be tried in front of the Syrian people for its crimes. Now, this is probably one of the craziest stories of the week, because if you really think about it, if Russia goes ahead with this extradition, that would mean that there are certain elements within the Russian government, the bureaucracy, maybe even Foreign Minister Lavrov, who is willing to cooperate with this Zionist-backed, this weird Turkey-aligned group that has taken power in Damascus, these group of former Islamic Sunni terrorists who have now taken power in Syria, and they're willing to perhaps even sacrifice their former allies, not just sacrificing someone who they've worked with for over 10 years, but they're also willing to compromise. And of course, as we've stated on prior shows, Conrad, this will show a sort of moral inadequacy of Russian foreign policy, and even maybe some sort of ethical lines are being crossed. Maybe future countries, when they cooperate with Russia, will be a lot less inclined to perhaps rely on Russian aid, given that Russia is willing to sacrifice some of its former allies and literally send them out on trial. So really big concerns. And what does HDS or al-Jolani offer? Now, it's not HDS. What does he offer in return for the extradition of Assad? Well, he states that Russia can keep its base in Khmeimim, Latakia, and Tartus. So it's quite a clever move by the Damascus government now. And of course, it's almost like Russia, it's been busy shipping all of its equipment back home. Now it really stands before a very important choice, whether or not it goes according to its Christian morality and standards, and it simply does not make any deals with the terrorist Sunni Wahhabi government, or it crosses a certain line, morally speaking, and of course extradites Dr. Bashar al-Assad as well as his family to Damascus. And I think this will ultimately be one of these big red lines that if Russia crosses, I think they will lose a lot of support in terms of foreign policy, especially in the second and third world, if they see this happen in Syria.
No, I completely agree. I mean, you can't just hand people over that trusted you to keep them safe like that in that kind of high-level geopolitical context. Makes a lot of sense. But speaking of leaders that have fallen, Mohammed Daif, the sort of leader of Hamas, I believe the Al-Qassam brigades, I'm forgetting which thing he was the leader of. It's been announced by Hamas that he is deceased. I don't know how long he's been deceased. I think it's probably been several months, but they didn't want to announce that, of course, with Yahya Sinwar and all of these other resistance leaders also getting taken out. So that, of course, has been announced, but it appears with all these footage we're seeing from Gaza that Al-Qassam brigades, Al-Quds brigades, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, all of these groups have been able to recruit from the Gazan population and replenish, and it appears that they have just as many people than ever. And there's these crazy videos of these Hamas guys standing at the square where all of the hostage exchanges are happening, and Gazan kids just come up with them and are like, hey, can I get a picture with your gun? And the Hamas guy just hands the kid a gun and takes a picture with his phone and then gives it back to him. It's it's kind of funny. But you mentioned Syria. Of course, the big news is from Syria regarding the whole Israel question, for example. We know they're setting up operational bases on top of Mount Hermon. They continue to advance in the Quneitra province. They blew up the Syrian government building in the town of Quneitra, which is the main town they're currently occupying outside of the Golan region. But a video came out of a strike on Al-Quneitra, the region that Israel is occupying, from the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria, which is a new Iran-backed group that, that name existed 10 plus years ago, but most of those members ended up joining these other militias that ended up being the current Sunni government that is led by Jolani. So it appears that Iran has consolidated some of its groups and are going to be able to, in some capacity, strike Israel, but I don't know how effective any of that is going to be. But we are about to hear from the first foreign head of state to visit Syria, and it's no surprise it is the Emir of Qatar, Tamim bin Hamad, who many say is the most influential person in the Muslim world. But we know, of course, that the SNA, specifically HTS as well, their main supporters are Turkey and Qatar, which, again, it shows that the whole axis of resistance thing is, the people that were on the side of that were forced into it by the sheer Israeli aggression against the Palestinians, because Qatar and Turkey have no interest in becoming allies civilizationally, politically, in any capacity with Iran. And that is, of course, why HTS, the SNA, are the main people taking over Syria right now. And we have a big discussion with Eric Stryker again in that Ether Hour this week about Turkish-Israeli relations, Turkish-Russian relations, Turkish-Iranian relations, all that good stuff. But Turkey, the SDF, the SNA, they continue to fight in the Euphrates region and up in northeastern Syria. And again, the Kurds and the PKK have said that they're willing to withdraw if the U.S., for example, could stay, and the U.S. is trying to be able to stay. That there was fake news, I believe, from Al Arabiya News that Trump had said he wanted to pull out of Syria, but Trump immediately came out and said that he did not say anything like that, and they're exploring all sorts of options. And again, we know that Israel wants the Druze and the Kurds to be as empowered as possible. And there's even news coming, from the new government apparently is persecuting the Druze, that they are trying to consolidate the Syrian state. I guess the Jolani Damascus government does not want Kurdistan, a Druze state. They probably also don't want Israel, taking the property that it has. We talk about how for the first time Israel struck the Syrian regime last week, and then the Syrian regime has in some way responded, obviously not as forcefully as this Iranian-backed group, the Islamic Resistance Front in Syria. But in general, Syria is continuing to be one of the main battlefronts for greater Israel, as Lebanon is, of course. In many ways, Syria and Lebanon is almost connecting as the same battle for Israel as they occupy the Golan Heights, the Quneitra province, and all of the area south of the Litani River, that the Lebanese armed forces and everybody are worried and saying that they don't think Israel is going to withdraw at the ceasefire deadline that had been outlined with Hezbollah. And now Israel is even continuing to strike areas outside of Beirut and other supposed Hezbollah and even non-Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, which, again, these people just truly have no shame and are able to act with impunity. And unfortunately, we saw Smotrich meet with Mike Witkoff, Trump's envoy to the Middle East, and was very happy, despite the fact that supposedly Witkoff supported the Gaza ceasefire that Smotrich was against. It appears that the hardliners in Israel are, for better or for worse right now, happier with Trump than Biden. However, things could go any way. Trump is a bit of a wild card on the foreign policy front. But unless you have anything else to say about Syria, Gaza, West Bank, I'd love your thoughts on Lebanon, Dimitri.
No, of course, I think you were completely correct in stating that Israeli interests, like just north of their border, of course, in Syria, and of course in northeastern Golan Heights, and of course just south of the Litani River, are very much contingent on Western support. Exactly how the West will react to their occupation of these lands. How will Donald Trump, of course, Donald Trump being in favor of West Bank occupation, how will he react to Israel taking these additional territories for so-called military emergency security, right? How closely is that tied to Benjamin Netanyahu personally, if he was, say, to step down, would a future prime minister of Israel secede these lands to the respective governments of both Syria, of course, this new HTS-led Al-Jilani government, and of course the new president of Lebanon? Or would the future administration of Israel, which most likely I think will come in less than a decade's time, especially given all these protests and the various breakdowns amongst the Israelis, all the people stepping down, how will they react to the potential call from Lebanon, its northern allies, so-called, to hand over these lands? And I think generally speaking, Lebanon is like one of these good examples, because both Lebanon and Syria have been affected very deeply by civil wars over the last 40 years, and both countries have been weakened to such an extent that they pose no real risk to Israel moving forward. And the only, of course, groups within these two respective nations that did pose a risk to Israel were essentially almost like non-government groups, essentially Hezbollah and all these organizations, the RGC, of course, acting out of Syria, coming from Iran. So the official militaries of both respective nations did not pose a risk to Israel over the last 40 years, and I think Israel wants to keep it that way. So they're very happy for the instability, and hence their support, of course, for the Kurds in eastern Syria, and for this standoff that we see currently in Lebanon amongst the official government troops and Hezbollah. They're happy for that to continue. They're happy for this bizarre status quo where there's no clear authority among the Lebanese people. There's this clear sort of religious division and this massive fear, right? This almost like a post-World War II fear that the Soviet Union had during the Cold War under Khrushchev, when they wanted to avoid the Third World War no matter what, even if it negatively affected, of course, the state of the USSR and its economic policies and its relations with other nations. They want to avoid war no matter what the cost is. I mean, the Lebanese people have been morally and, I think, mentally broken. And Israel is very much aware that the only group in Lebanon which is currently standing up to it is Hezbollah. So I think the pressure will continue against Hezbollah, whether it's through diplomacy with the new Lebanese government or whether it's through these massive strikes south of the Litani River. So I think now that the deadline has been passed, Conrad, and we're well and truly clear of it, the deadline for peace and the standstill between Hezbollah and Israel, I would not be surprised if perhaps action is reignited, especially now that Hamas is happy for the standstill to keep going in Gaza. And of course, Hezbollah, with its questionable sort of leadership at the moment, it's not quite clear exactly how Hezbollah will receive further support, because Syria, again, essentially the land between Iran and Lebanon, where Hezbollah has its major bases of operations, is now split and occupied by forces which are very sort of, let's just say, anti-Shia. I think Israel really does smell the blood in the water. So I wouldn't be surprised if before maybe the summer, before July, August, the conflict in Lebanon is reignited and Hezbollah is again targeted by the Israeli military, especially if the entire Gaza process and West Bank process goes very smoothly for the Israeli Zionist state. At least that's my sort of futuristic prediction, given everything. I don't think Israel is ready to lose some of the footholds it's gained south of the Litani River, unfortunately, I think, for the Lebanese people, because many civilians, as we've seen, Israel is happy for its Air Force to strike civilian targets when needed to demoralize the local population, to strike at the relatives of people who are related to fighters in Hezbollah, and they're happy to destroy entire families, communities, in order for that land to be cleared of the Gentiles and, of course, return to the greater Israeli state, as is their sort of prophetic view of the future.
That's exactly what's happening. And of course, Russia has called the Syrian ambassador to Russia. They seem to be slowly but surely moving forward with a kind of soft recognition and wanting to negotiate. Again, I don't think they're going to hand over Assad, but the fact that all this is going on while Israel eats up the south, they're still fighting over in Latakia and Tartus. There's major fighting between the SNA and the SDF, and even the U.S. is launching its own drone strikes on the Idlib region, all while the Emir of Qatar meets new President Jolani. It's pretty crazy that all of that is happening at the same time as the Gaza West Bank crackdowns and the Lebanon war. And somehow people aren't calling this the Third World War yet, because it obviously is when you look at all of these fronts and understand the potential and how, it's pretty much inevitable at this point that we get dragged into the regional war with the strikes on the Iranian nuclear capabilities, because all this other stuff is continuing because Israel just refuses to back down in all of these regions. So we live in interesting times, and at this point, I think it's far too late. I think Cameron McGregor is right that the regional war in Iran and the Middle East, it's way too late to put that cat back in the bag. But speaking of it being the Third World War, it's time to move to Russia, Ukraine, the other hot front that's been raging the longest at this point. And again, when you tie all this in together, and we're going to get into Africa in a second, this is one of those episodes where it's really indisputable that the World War really is now, and that this show is aptly titled, and that frankly, we're some of the only people that are willing to call it as it is, because so many people are afraid, oh, I'm going to get a prediction wrong or whatever. It's not a prediction. The Third World War is already here, and you have to be willing to look through the glass and not fall for all of the obscure tricks that everybody is trying to play on each other to prevent, themselves from getting committed to a situation that they fear will damage them strategically. The US, Russia, China, all these groups, Iran, they don't want to admit that we're in the Third World War because then people might start adopting a different consciousness about all of this and looking at who is actually behind things. But we do have to get into the situation in Russia. Of course, we are seeing more and more strikes by the Storm Shadow missiles from Ukraine into Russia, specifically on a lot of their missile and energy production facilities. We, of course, are hearing more and more about the Kursk region, which, again, isn't. Both sides are kind of keeping things hush-hush, but Russia is advancing just like Russia is advancing in Donetsk, getting closer and closer to Pokrovsk. And again, I don't know if they're planning on using Pokrovsk as some kind of negotiating chip, which would be really stupid. I'm thinking that Putin is trying to secure all of the Donetsk region at the very least before any kind of dialogue with Trump begins. But again, Zelensky is getting farther and farther into his illegal term. Elections, people are going to be calling for those. Every country around them, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, they have all of this electoral fervor. Belarus, of course, just had their elections. Lukashenko remaining in power, of course, no contest. He had a good interview with a Sky News reporter. We're going to talk about that in a second, but we'd love the updates. Dmitry, everything across the front, Kursk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, what is going on in the Ukraine?
Yeah, it's quite typical, frankly. The front lines have not moved too much. I think Velika Novoselovka, as we said, Большая Novoselovka has definitely been captured by Russians. There's all kinds of new footage from some of the tall apartment buildings of not just Russian flags flying, but also flags with, of course, the icon of Christ the Savior, not made by hand, so of course flying over, which is quite based. You have Orthodox flags flying all over these apartment buildings. So we know that some of these stormtrooper squads of Russians, these sort of frontline infantry, very, very skilled, very brave soldiers, have, in fact, Orthodox Christian ideology sort of backing them. And in fact, they, of course, members of the Orthodox Church, is always nice to sort of see. But on the fronts, of course, the two major towns, of course, 30,000 people roughly prior to the outbreak of the SMO in population, Chasiv Yar and Toretsk, which we've been talking about for a while now. As the Russian troops move to sort of encircle Pokrovsk slowly, there's no real indication that Toretsk or Chasiv Yar have fallen. There is some weird stories from Ukrainian media sources, especially on Telegram, and from some Western sources, which I think are somewhat uninformed. They're not really citing any sort of primary reports from journalists, but they're just claiming that Chasiv Yar has fallen to the Russians, which, again, this is quite blackmailing for Ukrainians. But from the Russian sources, it appears that Chasiv Yar the Ukrainians are still holding on, alas, in a very small sort of pocket, but they're still fighting the Russians off, especially in the northern Chasiv Yar, as the Russians are taking Chasiv Yar from the south. So Chasiv Yar still remains in Ukrainian control. Of course, the city is so decimated, the photographs of it are completely apocalyptic. And the same, of course, goes for Toretsk, which whatever remains of it now is just ruins. It's very much like from the video game Fallout. It's very much as if a nuclear bomb has been dropped, like some sort of, if Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not made of wood and cardboard paper, you would probably look like something like this has taken place, when the Americans dropped the atomic bombs on the two cities, because it just looks completely decimated. And still, the Ukrainians are fighting on. It seems like, of course, some of these speeches given by Zelensky, Syrsky, some of the military leadership are bolstering the Ukrainian morale. And it's quite curious that I think they actually do believe that despite their heavy losses, that they still have the larger military. And in fact, they do. Like, there are more recruits and there are more military servicemen in the Ukrainian army than there are in the Russian. And the Russian media is just reporting very bizarre. And I mean, this is state-run media, but they're reporting these weird, not anti-conscription, but anti-mobilization messages such as, well, we have a stronger military force, but this is tactical. This is a strategic decision by the Russian Ministry of Defense to not mobilize more troops because it's saving Russian lives. When it's the exact opposite. The truth is, if your army is larger, you're less likely to, of course, receive losses, and you're more likely to, of course, achieve victory faster, therefore saving the lives of both, of course, the enemies, who, in fact, in this particular case, are not really enemies. They're just brainwashed Russians, Ukrainians, as per Putin's speech on February 22nd and February 24th, 2022. And he said himself, Ukrainians are Russians, just simply, of course, afflicted by this demonic presence of Ukrainianism. And of course, the lives of Russian servicemen are also saved by just having a bulkier military pushing forward at faster rates, more efficient bombardment, and again, taking enemy prisoners, not simply slowly mulching them, breaking them down by the thousands and hundreds, as we've seen in recent months. So it's a very sort of questionable messaging that's taking place in Russian media. And the other Russian media story related to the front line, and you mentioned Kursk, Conrad, so Kursk, the progression there has not really been favorable to the Russians as of late. Of course, we remember the 5th and 6th of January. There's a lot of stories coming out exactly how Ukraine tried to push out of Kursk earlier this year, just before Christmas, actually, just before Orthodox Julian calendar Christmas. The Ukrainians did try to take some major positions in Kursk, but failed because, as per the interviews from the Russian soldiers in Kursk, the Ukrainians tried to head-on break the Russian defenses in Kursk, which was absolutely insane. So they drove their tanks right at the defensive lines, the BTRs, the troop carriers, and many of them were destroyed outright, simply on the roads. So there was a huge loss of Ukrainian troops just early in January. And so at the moment, the Ukrainian sort of backup army has been frankly shattered in Kursk. So they're still holding on, however. So that's the major unfortunate consideration. And as I mentioned, the media, what does the media say about Kursk in Russia? Well, it's quite interesting because you do see this lack of media coverage of what the Ukrainians are doing in Kursk. They're simply covering the Donetsk Oblast, maybe Kherson, Zaporozhye, a lot more than they are covering Kursk. And I think the main consideration, as I've told you off air, Conrad, and this is not just my speculation, a lot of Russian patriotic right-wing military commentators are saying this, that the Russian bureaucratic government, the Ministry of Defense, are trying to cover its own behind by not focusing on Kursk, because if they display certain footage, which is now available from the Kursk Oblast on Telegram, some of the footage is extremely violent. I'll talk about it in a moment. If they provide some of the key information from the Kursk Oblast, the Russian public will be asking these really interesting questions, such as, well, if Kursk is so bad, what exactly allowed the Ukrainians to take it in the first place? And the answer is not in favor of the Russian Ministry of Defense because, well, it was, of course, a negligent move not defending the Russian borders adjacent to Ukraine in the north. So it's the fault of the Russian government, first and foremost. It isn't the fault of Ukraine because Ukraine simply strikes at the weak underbelly around Bryansk, Belgorod, and Kursk. This is only normal to do, especially by a state run by lunatics from Kiev, Zelensky, etc., run by CIA and Mossad officers and specialists. And to avoid this sort of blame, the Russian Ministry of Defense simply, and the mainstream media simply stops focusing on Kursk, and they're just hyper-focusing on Donetsk, hyper-fixating on some of the areas which are frankly less important at the moment in terms of there's still fighting going on. The Russians, of course, are still taking many villages in the Donetsk Oblast. Of course, Chasov Yar, etc., are still being fought over. However, this is why they're sending these international journalists very often to Donetsk as opposed to Kursk. Kursk, nobody wants to see what's taking place there because the blame will primarily not fall on Ukraine. It'll fall on the Russian decision makers and their negligence. So you can see kind of the motivation there. And now the war crime in Kursk, this is, for the Russians, this was completely shocking, posted by Oleg Tsaryov, the former Ukrainian politician who was one of the leading Novorossiya spokespersons who essentially decided to support Lugansk, Donetsk during the so-called rebellion in 2014, once the Maidan revolution took place in late 2013. Oleg Tsaryov on his Telegram channel posted some very striking footage of Ukrainian soldiers, and you can tell they are Ukrainians, the badges, the uniform, etc., are taking out bodies of Russian civilians, maimed, essentially corpses, out of a basement. And then he posted another clip of an interview of one of these Ukrainian soldiers seen in the video, and in the video, the Ukrainian soldiers stating that they've captured a bunch of these Kursk Russian villages, taped their hands, feet, dragged them into the basement, 20 of them, and then threw some grenades in and blew them all up. Reminiscent of like almost the Alapayevsk martyrs, of course, on the 18th of July, 1918. It's like a real war crime, just death of civilians. And this footage was released a few days ago, and it's caused a huge upstir amongst the Russian patriots. And the Russians want blood, they want revenge. There's a real call for sort of vengeance amongst the Russians against the Ukrainians. And this is happening, Conrad, whilst there are big so-called discussions of peace talks, right? It's very interesting how I think Oleg Tsaryov very much is trying to just show the reality of the front lines, the Ukrainian war crimes that have been taking place. He's trying to present the true image, whilst other, perhaps more mainstream Russian television channels are not showing some of the things which are actually taking place in terms of playing down the Ukrainian occupation of Kursk in order to protect themselves, as well as protect their leaders who are funding them, whilst the situation on the front lines is very, very dire, and there's a lot of really criminal activity taking place there. This is also reflected in some of the church persecution news, which we'll cover, but just on the civilian and the military end, the bloodshed continues. And generally speaking, across the front lines, which what we see in Zaporozhye, there's not much movement there, especially closer to the Dnieper River. Close to, of course, the Zaporozhye city and Dnieper, Russians and Ukrainians are long-range bombarding each other with artillery. There's not much movement going north, so it's not like Zaporozhye is going to fall anytime soon. And even more interesting, of course, on the eastern side of the Dnieper River in the Kherson near Novaya Kakhovka Dam. That village of Novaya Kakhovka is being bombarded heavily by Ukrainian artillery. So it's almost like Ukraine is too scared to traverse the Dnieper River to invade Kherson, but they're still quite content in bombing Russian villages, potentially hurting civilians, of course, trying to kill as many Russians as possible from a long range. So the front line really is shifting very slightly, of course, into Donetsk Oblast, further west. However, there's no real massive takeovers. And as you mentioned, there's that ever-present threat of long-range drone bombardment of Russian targets. And frankly, there's one particular story of the Druzhba gas pipeline, which runs into Belarus. This is just north of the Bryansk Oblast. A drone dropped and apparently the Russians are claiming, and the Western sources are claiming, this is a new type of drone with some sort of either stealth technologies or maybe some sort of anti-detection apparatus attached, because it flew almost to a very key position near the gas pipeline and dropped a bomb on it. Now, the Druzhba pipeline travels from Russia, of course, west through Belarus and even into Germany, Poland, etc. So this is German gas, which is being placed at risk by the Ukrainians. Notice, just like the so-called Ukrainian plot to damage the Turkish pipeline, right, the Turkish-Russian pipeline, Blue Stream, the Ukrainians are so they're just so crazy, they're so bloodthirsty that they're willing to even hurt their own allies and their own compatriots in NATO in order to achieve a defeat over Russia. It's completely insane. It's like, well, it's similar to, of course, the US supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, sort of allying themselves with a group which is so irrational and so barbaric in their actions that, in fact, they may be even hurting states like Poland and Germany in terms of their energy prices, etc. So huge consideration there. So the front lines have been stable, and there hasn't been really any talk about Russians, of course, are willing, and this has been stated by Dmitry Peskov and some of the other Russian top officials. They've stated they're willing to sit down at the table with American officials to discuss some sort of mediation, but they've stated very openly that their goals are still not met, and they're still willing to proceed with the SMO as per plan. Right. So they're not claiming that they're willing to sit down for a peace treaty discussion, but they're willing to at least sit at the table and have some sort of mediation talks with a powerful player like America. And I think that's interesting. They haven't stated that Zelensky has any legitimacy. Notice the Belarusian election, of course, or the West claiming Lukashenko is not a legitimate president, and Russia and Lukashenko claiming that Zelensky, by not holding an election last year, is no longer a legitimate president. So it's almost like a mirrored tactics in terms of how does democracy grant legitimacy to a certain regime? Very similar arguments used by both sides.
No, it's a good thing you brought up the Belarus elections. Kind of caught us all off guard. We weren't even hearing about it. So good job from Lukashenko not broadcasting the democracy meme too hard to give them a chance to do another Svetlana Tianaskova, color revolution situation. But leading up to the election, of course, Lukashenko, he said, I've never discussed the unification of Russia and Belarus with Putin, which, again, we have, who knows if that's true. But he was elected, and then he held a press conference, and the funniest moment from the press conference was some Sky News reporter, which, again, I want to point out how hilarious it is that these people come to Belarus, they come to Russia, these places, and they accuse Lukashenko, Putin of being dictators to their face as they stand there. The free press, supposedly, they're asking questions. How many Belta, RT, Sputnik, other Belarusian media characters are outside of Scotland Yard or Downing Street or in the White House press room? Like, none. So these people coming in accusing these admittedly illiberal states of these dictatorial measures, it's like, look, man, if you were really scared of that, you wouldn't be asking this question, because you'd think they were going to throw you in a gulag. Just like you can see the look on the face of, is it a 60 Minutes guy when Lukashenko said, oh, we will massacre all of your people you send here. Oh, does that make you upset? Like, remember that whole interview? I think he wants to make them a little more afraid. But regardless, the Sky News reporter asked, how can you claim that you're a legitimate president when you don't allow any opposition and arrest the opposition? And Lukashenko responded, you got to a point where you were recently ruled by an Indian. The Sky News reporter, of course, is British. Why am I saying this? You used to be an empire, and now your subordinates have come in and are ruling you. So Lukashenko, he just says it how it is, and you have to love him for it. And again, we hope that much like Putin, that his succession situation can get handled, and perhaps that will be the job of Nikolai Lukashenko and the future Tsar of Russia, will be to meet and discuss, of course, the unification of White Russia and Big Russia, to begin the creation of the cohesive Russian state, which hopefully will also include most of Ukraine. But unless you have any final thoughts on Ukraine, Dimitri, we have to move on to Africa. And of course, the situation there is, a totally new front in many ways, which is this Rwandan invasion of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which it really proves how fake and gay these African countries are, considering the DRC, one of the most populous countries in Africa, maybe the most populous country at this point. I think over 100 million people, the massive central country there, and they are just getting taken to task by these Rwandan militias. And the headline here, of course, Rwanda-backed M23 rebels pledged to march all the way to Kinshasa, which is the capital of the DRC, which isn't even close to the Rwandan side of the border. So if that actually happened, that would be a major development. And the Rwandan-backed M23 group vowed Thursday to continue the march of liberation to the DRC Congo capital as its fighters made further advances in the mineral-rich east of the country. This is from RFI. The group's capture of most of Goma, the capital of North Kivu province, is a dramatic escalation in a region that has seen decades of conflict involving multiple armed groups. Rwanda says its primary interest is to eradicate fighters linked to the 1994 genocide, but is accused of seeking to profit from the region's reserves of minerals used in global electronics. We will continue to march all the way to Kinshasa, Corneille Nangaa, the head of the coalition groups, including the M23, told reporters in Goma. We are in Goma and we will not leave for as long as the questions for which we took up arms have not been answered, he said. He went on to promise that the group would restore electricity and security in the city in the coming days, adding that they would establish humanitarian corridors to help the displaced return. It comes after Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi pledged to continue fighting in an address to the nation late Wednesday, promising a vigorous and coordinated response against these terrorists and their sponsors is underway. Local sources told AFP late Wednesday that Kigali, which is the capital of Rwanda, backed fighters were advancing on a new front and had seized 2 districts in the South Kivu province. The Congolese army has yet to make a statement about the M23 advance. After days of intense clashes that left more than 100 dead, nearly 1,000 wounded, according to an AFP tally, some Goma residents on Thursday ventured out to take stock. So this is a big development. Obviously, the Rwandan president Kagame is a strong man. Rwanda is one of the few kind of successful for its size countries that manages to advance economically, has a lot of powerful mercenaries and militia groups that operate outside of its borders. Uganda, another country that kind of operates this way. We remember the son of the president of Uganda, who's also the head of the armed forces, talking all about how he could march to Kenya and take Nairobi whenever he wanted and do all these sorts of things. And it appears that these tiny little countries are very much able, with just a few thousand solidly trained military operators, are able to make big differences in their spheres of influence. And, Kagame has called the M23 and these forces part of the Rwandan military. And it appears that South Africa is now getting involved because they support the DRC, and Rwanda and South Africa are talking, and South Africa's claiming they're going to send troops to the border to enforce things. But again, perhaps this could all tie into some of the BRICS play as well. I'm not even sure where Russia stands. I guess perhaps they might support the DRC side with South Africa, the more multipolar side of things. But again, the Sahel situation is ongoing. Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali all officially left ECOWAS this week entirely. We know that the situation with the Houthis continues on the Red Sea, which involves Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan. The Sudan war, of course, is ongoing, with Russia continuing to kind of look at both sides on who is going to win so they can get their Red Sea port in Sudan operating, which now that Syria has fallen, I think they're probably more and more interested in. And of course, the situation in Libya continues as the Tripoli Turkish-backed government continues to try to consolidate power to eventually, I think, launch more offensive campaigns against the Russian-backed Haftar Libyan National Army. So Africa, very much a hot continent at this point, and this situation between the DRC and Rwanda, for those that don't know, this could turn into the third African World War, because the first and second African World Wars in the late 90s and early 2000s, those have tens of millions of displaced people, millions and millions of dead, particularly fighting in places like DRC, Central African Republic, Rwanda, Uganda, with all these groups that in countries we've just mentioned funding different militia groups trying to consolidate. Remember, the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, has never been consolidated as a truly controlled country. Yes, its borders exist. It's internationally recognized, but large swaths of the country, like many African countries, are fully controlled by ethnic religious militias, by other bordering states, and all sorts of other interest groups and foreign lobbies and foreign mercenaries even. So I know right now, I believe it was on the DRC side, there were dozens of Romanian mercenaries that were fighting and have now been forced to surrender in Goma to M23 and the Rwandans. If you have any more details on that, Dimitri.
Yeah, of course. I think it's really curious how the Rwanda Congolese situation links to Romania. I think that's very fascinating because on one hand, like there were rumors, say last year and the year before that, there were Wagner present in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, right? However, there's no real footage or any proof at the moment that Wagner is engaged with any of these M23 fighters from Rwanda or any of these other groups, but the particular mercenaries that are involved are, of course, of Romanian and French origin, and they're being led by this neo-Yevgeny Prigozhin type figure. When I say neo, but in Romania, I suppose he's really well-known, Horatio Potra. And his name is Horatiu. I guess it's like a Romanian version of Horatio because those Romanians, they love their Latinization, like Horatio from Shakespeare's Hamlet. You know, they love these Latinized ancient Roman names. So it's quite fascinating. The Dacian people are very inventive, of course, with their given Christian names. Quite fascinating, very not Slavic of them. But Mr. Potra, of course, the Yevgeny Prigozhin, he looks like an ambiguous Eastern European. He has a bald head, sort of big nose, very sort of clear, predatory eyes. He has deleted all of his social media recently after the M23 group, which you mentioned, Conrad, from Rwanda. They've actually captured at least close to 300 Romanian mercenary prisoners who they surrounded on the border of the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda. And all these people have been extradited back to Romania. They've been put on a plane and sent home. So they weren't necessarily killed or executed in any fashion. So M23, in some ways, this sort of paramilitary group, as much as for some of us, it may seem a little bit scary, the M23 group, in fact, is fighting kind of like a just war in a way. In their own eyes, what they're claiming is that, of course, we all remember the 1994 huge genocide in Rwanda. Potentially, at least according to Rwandan legislation, it's led to at least 1 million deaths. And as we talked off air, Conrad, these deaths are very savage, not even by gunfire, by literally by cold steel and rape and all these other, of course, close to 500,000 women apparently were assaulted in this crazy jungle massacre that took place more than 3 decades ago now. So quite an intense situation. And this particular conflict ongoing now is in many ways a carryover from 1994. So we notice just like in Syria, Lebanon, Israel, a lot of these former conflicts really form the current situation. It's almost like the unfreezing of these world furnaces of human conflict, vengeance, etc. And this is exactly what they're after. They're after vengeance. The M23 is saying that they're going after the Hutus and the former militias who massacred all the Tutsis in 1994. And some of these Hutu former militia personnel are actually hiding out in eastern Congo. So this is who they're going after. It's essentially this march for justice in a way, almost like the M23 are carrying out a special military operation into the bordering country in order to stop these genocidal maniacs. So almost like we see Erdogan doing in northeastern Syria, of course, fighting the Kurds, and then again, Israel claiming they're carrying out a special military operation of some sort south of the Litani River. All these countries are using this Putinesque type pretext in order to invade the neighboring country, or at least invade. It's a strong rhetoric here, but in each particular situation, I'm sure it's justified or unjustified in some way. In this particular context, they're stating that they're defending the poor Tutsis living in eastern Congo who are still being oppressed. And apparently there are Tutsi complaints from the Congo that the Tutsis are ethnic Rwandans, one of the tribes that was genocided all those years ago. So the M23 have definitely like a proper pretext from their perspective, from the Rwandan sort of national view, that they're not just going into the Congo to cause mischief. They're there to bring solidarity and to bring the criminals who've caused all this havoc in their own homeland to justice. And of course, the Congo being this, as you said, heavily divided country, it's a country which is not homogenous by any stretch. There's a lot of different African ethnicities, tribes, and people there. It's quite easy for this Rwandan paramilitary group to make some impressive gains in the jungles and among the rivers and mountains in some of these areas. So it'll be quite interesting to see exactly how M23 sort of how far they go into the Congo, exactly what their goals are, and how the international community responds, right? Because as you said, the so-called BRICS nations, or at least South Africa, seems to be against this sort of militia type move. But again, there's this post-colonial drive, sort of the aspect of justice, which I think a lot of countries can kind of get behind. For example, in the Muslim world, in some ways, M23 is acting like the HDS fighting against President Bashar al-Assad's government. who, HDS claimed that they're fighting against Assad and him being a sort of bloodthirsty dictator who's caused all this harm to the Syrian people. M23 is claiming the same. They're fighting against the Congolese government who have allied themselves with these evil Hutus. So it'll be quite interesting how the African side, the Central African scenario of Third World War plays out. And this is probably just the beginning.
I think here on World War Now, we can tentatively come out in support of the Rwandan side here in many ways, because Rwanda, I think, is the kind of the model for Africa. African states need to be smaller, more ethnically homogenous, and then able to be ruled over by basically like a Christian African fascist like Paul Kagame, who's been in power for decades at this point, has organized the Rwandan military into an actual formidable force that is able to go around Africa and do things almost like the white man had been able to do in the past. And again, like Rwanda had even been the place where the UK was going to deport its migrants. They're actually kind of stable. They're able to handle things. They have development. And again, if more countries, some of these big countries, if they could balkanize and more Paul Kagame type characters could take power, that could be a way we could actually see some real nation building occur in these tribal territories run by low IQ blacks and Bantus. Again, this could really be, if Rwanda is successful and more people can look towards Rwanda, and even some of these colonial sponsors, including Russia and China, I view them still as all of this. If we're going to use a word, it's all still somewhat colonialist, and I don't view that negatively at all. But if they can perhaps impose a Rwanda model on some of these areas, look, DRC would probably be a lot more successful as a few different Rwandas, not as this giant attempt at some Central African empire. I don't think it's ever really going to hold itself together properly. But I think the presence of the Romanian troops gives us a really good, easy transition here into Europe. And Calin Georgescu, he did a recent interview with Romanian journalist Ion Cristoi, and he said a lot of amazing things. I'm really just going to read a lot of direct quotes here. He said, on January 27th, Donald Trump, signed a decree canceling foreign aid to Ukraine. What does this mean? This is a clear message to Volodymyr Zelensky to negotiate a lasting peace, otherwise he will be gone. For us, this is crucial because when you look around, you see various countries talking about changing borders, and this is where we come in to seize the opportunity. Georgescu laments the continued Romanian support for the Ukrainian war effort, warning that if Romania doesn't stop after Donald Trump's cessation of foreign aid, it will find itself on the losing side, drawing a parallel to September 1940, when King Carol II fled the country after being forced to cede 1/3 of Romanian territory to its neighbors. Carol II pursued a heavily pro-British foreign policy at a time when Germany and the USSR were gearing up for war and were annexing territories from their neighbors. Refusing an alliance with either of the two superpowers, which ended up resulting in the June 1940 ultimatum as per the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Second Vienna Award, and the Treaty of Craiova. Georgescu made the parallel to say that Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs is out of touch with the current geopolitical realities and that their mistakes would cost Romania greatly. He goes on to say, the world is changing, borders are changing, and what are we doing? We have legitimate interests in northern Bukovina, the Bujak, and northern Maramuresh/Transcarpathia. Although we will have to share it with the Hungarians, Lvov will go to the Polish, Little Russia will go to the Russians. Ion Cristoi, the journalist, he says, but are you sure Ukraine will be carved up? And Georgescu responds, of course, there is no other way. Ukraine is an artificial state. They don't have a real set of defined borders. And then goes on. This is all from Wallachian Gazette, by the way. They then go on to say the reason Calin Georgescu gives for supporting moving the Romanian embassy to Jerusalem, per the wishes of Israeli nationalists who claim Jerusalem is their capital, is because Jerusalem is a place of pilgrimage for Romanians, and moving the embassy to the city would make it closer and more available for consular services than having it in Tel Aviv. That's cope. That is right there. As much as I like that he isn't just saying because we support Israel, he's having to frame this in Christian terms, which shows you that most Romanians obviously don't actually support Israel. So he's having to say, no, we're moving the embassy so that you guys can go on pilgrimage and go and see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Man, it's definitely not because I'm a Club of Rome member and love Jews. But Wallachian Gazette goes on to say, Calin Georgescu makes even more land claims, this time over Hungary and Serbia, citing a line from a poem written by the nationalist poet Mihai Eminescu, from the Dniester to the Tisa rivers, saying that it is now the time for Romania to play off the US and Russia against each other to obtain historical territories, arguing these land grabs are an advantage for NATO because this way NATO's territory will be getting bigger, leaving less neutral areas for others to grab. And then he posts a map. I think we're going to have this map in the thumbnail, but this was a very explosive interview. I'm sure people in Romania found this very exciting. I don't know if it polarized people, if it gained people to his side. I'm not sure exactly. Of course, he's making a big push to win this new round of elections that's going to be happening in February and March. Again, I hope he can pull it off. I know that the EU says they're just going to steal it again and do the same thing in Germany. So I really don't know how that's going to go. But, this is real nationalist stuff. However, one of the things that he really talked about, and he pretty much says exactly the point that I'm going to make, that it's an advantage for NATO, this big new territorial grab. And remember, Georgescu, former Club of Rome member, in our episode with Anthony of Westgate, we talk about the U.S. moves on Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, how ultimately, if that goes through, the North American Union with the U.S., Mexico, Canada, Greenland could come into effect. We could get an EU type thing over here in North America. And next thing you know, we were kind of in this new world order of 10, 12 economic zones that then all come together at a United Nations type event to meet and centrally plan the world in this major Zog victory. And of course, him talking about dramatically expanding Romania, the country with the largest NATO base in the world, in the heartland of Eastern Europe, which again is sort of the main battlefront that everybody is bluffing after, Alfred Mackinder, heartland theory. If you control Eastern Europe, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Western Russia, then you can really control the entire Eurasian continent and thus control the entire world. Well, it seems to me he's proposing a way for NATO to gobble up a bunch of that territory without actually having to go to war, even in the situation where Ukraine loses. So a perfect example, much like we talk about with Trump, of how a nationalist leader could sort of be artificially propped up in a lot of these countries to achieve globalist goals that a nationalist Christian population would otherwise dramatically stand against. So I still support Georgescu. I think he'd be much better for the Romanian people. But again, he's a technocrat, and a lot of stuff he's saying here falls right in line with machinations that Zog and other world controllers may have. But unless you have anything else about Romania, Dimitri, we have some more things to talk about in Europe, of course, with Orban, Hungary, with things going on with Robert Fico in Slovakia as he's warned against a color revolution. And of course, there are even big protests in Serbia. If you have anything to talk about that before I get into the German story.
Yeah, I think the Serbian protests that took place recently over essentially government negligence oversight that caused the death on the train system of a few people, I think they're kind of bringing back this thread of the Serbian people being consolidated. And mind you, these protests were not like a colored revolution type protest. Essentially, the protests were majority, of course, by young people, but they estimate up to 1 million Serbs took to the streets in recent weeks. Of course, we haven't covered this because the protests themselves were very sort of domestic type of situation, essentially addressing, similar to Abkhazia, government corruption, and have brought about to, of course, powerful results such as the Serbian prime minister resigning from his post. Mind you, he was a very pro-left-wing, pro-European prime minister, so it's not like Alexander Vučić. It's not like, I think his replacement will probably be just as left-wing because Serbia is trying to keep a sort of balance between its how right-wing and how left-wing it is. I think Serbia is very much in this clasp of influences. On one hand, you have the Dodik types who are trying to align the Serbian people from Bosnia-Herzegovina more of Russia. On the other hand, you have Vučić who's trying to play neutral, and you have this former prime minister who was very much pro-European. And again, it shows the consolidation of the Orthodox people when they're unhappy with a certain decision of the government or a certain mistakes, which leads to the death of, this massive train accident that took place. The people can walk out to the streets and actually demand justice from their so-called public servants, which are elected by them, such as this prime minister figure. And I think generally speaking, this is a positive thing because most of these so-called Orthodox Christian Eastern European countries, which are majority Orthodox and have been LARPing as liberal democracies for many decades now, at least since the end of the Cold War, if you're going to pretend to be a liberal democracy, well then enjoy the protests and popular uprising because this is one of the aspects of the French Revolutionary Enlightenment model, which you choose to be governed by. So accept the fruits of the political design which you've chosen to copy-paste from the Freemasons and anti-Christian actors in Western Europe. And that's all I can really say about the Serbian situation. Generally, the entire Georgescu debacle, which I think we'll see play out in a few months' time, very much aligns with the general model, Conrad, of Central Eastern European politicians. You have like Fico, Dodik, Orban, Lukashenko, of course, Georgescu, these new popular right-wing figureheads who essentially speak very common sense things in terms of their domestic foreign policy approaches, anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic mass migration, anti-terrorism, and of course, anti-LGBTQ points. But everything they're speaking about essentially mirrors that of course, Donald J. Trump in his 2016 election run, and of course, the things Donald Trump has been saying now. So in some ways, they're very much following, and they're keeping this balance between trying to balance between like a Putin right-wing approach and of course, a Donald Trump right-wing approach. And I think it's really good. It's generally a decent environment, which the only country which now has been somewhat left out of the equation here is Germany. And Germany, of course, is been boiling up. And this is a country which literally has potential to change the future of Europe, because all these small minor countries, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, there's still quite a way to go in terms of them actually having some sort of impact on the greater European development, and even Poland, I would say, going forward. However, Germany, if it does rise up again, if it comes to this new post-Merkel right-wing consensus, we will and we may most definitely see some sort of impactful changes on how Europe will develop going forward. And by develop, I mean literally develop, become more human, become more right-wing, as opposed to post-human, degenerate left-wing, which unfortunately all of Europe has been moving in this direction for decades now.
No, totally true. And that moves us to a very exciting story out of Germany, which is a dynamic situation, of course. But Friedrich Merz, the leader of the Christian Democratic Union, Merkel's party, he is scrambling. The opinion polls are showing dramatically increasing support for the AfD at the national level. And I think he kind of tried to test the waters a little bit and greenlit a sort of collaboration in the Bundestag that where CDU would vote with AfD initially on this immigration bill, which was called the Influx Limitation Act, that was going to dramatically decrease the amount of immigrants coming into Germany, increase the amount of migrants, close the borders in a lot of ways to a lot of people. And the headlines were saying Berlin protests as Germany's far-right firewall collapses. Far-left people were protesting, very violently outside of the CDU headquarters. Of course, we remember recently huge protests took place outside of the AfD headquarters as they ramped up their campaigns for the February 23rd elections that will be happening next month. So very exciting things. But unfortunately, it appeared that perhaps Friedrich Merz would emerge as somebody that finally creates a right-wing, center-right coalition that actually gets things done for Germans. Of course, Angela Merkel issued a whole letter coming out saying she was ashamed, saying how the party can't do this, how this is all terrible. And of course, what happened? Of the 693 votes cast in the Bundestag, 338 voted yes for the act and 350 voted no, with 5 abstentions. 7 of these people in the CDU, of course, directly claiming Merkel's letter as the reason they did not vote for the act. So Merkel, despite not being in power, single-handedly standing up for the Great Replacement, continuing to support the genocide of the German people. What a sick, disgusting freak she is, right? But I think unfortunately, Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD, she came out very strongly against this. She said that Merz cannot be chancellor and cannot be a candidate for chancellor after this leadership failure. This was the dismantling of Friedrich Merz as a candidate for chancellor, Weidel said. Friedrich Merz jumped as a tiger and ended up as a bedside rug. There are no dissenters who stab a legitimate cause in the back, she said. So hopefully that in many ways, this could be a good thing if it allows the AfD to become the #1 most successful party and just completely skip over the CDU and the other center-right people that will always hold them back, that will always be like, oh, we can't do the obvious right thing because like Hitler might have done that or something like that. So I wouldn't say I'm happy to see this. It's a tragedy and just disgusting, frankly, how these leaders can betray their people like this. But perhaps it will light a fire under even some of the more moderate Germans and be like, look, you need to start getting these things done. But if you don't have any thoughts on that, Dimitri, we have a lot of church news to discuss. Obviously, South America, a few things going on there. Rick Grenell being sent to Venezuela, continued announcements of persecution against the opposition that is recognized by the United States and many other South American countries as the legitimate leaders of Venezuela. Maduro doesn't seem interested in that. There's more talk of invading Essequibo as well, just like the U.S. is ramping up talks with the groups that are on the Venezuelan border about potentially going in and overthrowing Maduro. So we're going to be keeping our eyes on Venezuela. But unless you have anything to say about the German situation, Dimitri, we got to talk about the persecution of the church in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some pretty intense developments taking place in Ukraine on both fronts. I would say both the Russians are, of course, pushing for Ukraine to, of course, lessen the persecution. There's still a lot of media coverage in Russia that's actually increasing, and I think this is good, of the persecutions, pointing out that this is an important factor of the entire SMO. And most importantly, Lavrov, for the first time in like a little while, has spoken out that UNESCO has failed to protect Ukrainian church goods, churches, etc., across Ukraine and defend them from persecution. It's good to see Foreign Minister Lavrov actually, again, speaking out, claiming that the United Nations is failing in its duty to defend some of these historical sites, as well as he mentioned a lot of the Russian Orthodox monuments, such as the statues to Saint Alexander Nevsky, etc., being destroyed by Ukrainian militants and all kinds of like militia groups which have arisen. Many of them, of course, Banderite in nature, very right wing. And Lavrov has openly spoken out about that. But I think we need more of that, naturally. This show can't be the only place where we kind of succinctly summarize all the weekly crimes of the Ukrainian state and all its contingencies against the Orthodox Church. So it'll be good if at least Russia puts in more effort in terms of publicizing some of this pretty important information. So we have the Uniates, the Roman Catholics. We mentioned Pope Francis last week with this sort of Zog left-wing agenda speaking out against the deportation of illegals. But notice how the Uniates in Western Ukraine are actually very militant in terms of they support the Ukrainian military very heavily. And in fact, there was a Uniate seminary in Western Ukraine which actually auctioned off for thousands of dollars a flag of the Ukrainian 24th Mechanized Brigade, which had like signatures. And of course, it was a Ukrainian flag with in the middle it had this golden lion with like a red and green shield, and it says Milites Regum, which stands for King's Infantry. And this is like one of the Ukrainian NATO creations, this powerful infantry division, which now has the signatures of its commanders, and they're auctioning it off at a Uniate Eastern Catholic seminary. So again, you can see the Catholics really contributing to the bloodshed against Orthodox Christians in this particular conflict in Ukraine, which is unfortunate. But we're keeping, of course, our eyes on this particular situation. You had very unfortunate interviews from Father John Skipora. This is a priest who's recently, in the last few weeks, he's confirmed that he has gone into schism. So he's moved from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Metropolitan Onufry to the false Metropolitan Syria Epiphany. And he's confirmed that he hasn't been commemorating Patriarch Kirill in this interesting radio interview. He said that I've stopped commemorating Patriarch Kirill in 2014 when Crimea was annexed by Russia. And the interview asked him, who allowed you to not commemorate your hierarch in 2014? I mean, like, you can't really do that. That's not canonical. And he said Metropolitan Meletius did. Metropolitan Meletius is still the head of the external church affairs under Metropolitan Onufry in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And what this particular story points towards is, Conrad, that unfortunately these compromises with anti-Russian attitudes already were made, and these concessions were being given to some of these very pro-Ukrainian, anti-Russian clergymen over the last few years. And look at the results. The priest that was given this concession to not pay for Patriarch Kirill all the way in 2014 has now officially gone into schism, and now is promoting schism on all these radio stations. So it only shows that if there's someone who's making very anti-schismatic, borderline heretical statements against the Russian Orthodox Church, maybe compromises shouldn't be made of these hardcore anti-Russian people. And generally speaking, for church ecclesiology, this is a good story of, well, you try to soften yourself on these liberals, and yet they only strike harder. They only go into schism more intensely. And just one of these few sort of examples. The other really big story was there was a crazy footage of a bus actually traveling to one of these Ukrainian war camps, and it was carrying Archimandrite Bogdan Pilgoy. And Archimandrite Bogdan Pilgoy was one of the few archimandrites in recent weeks who was seized by the Ukrainians. And what's curious is just a few weeks ago, before he was seized, he was giving a sermon where he stated that all the Ukrainian citizens which are being drafted into the army, conscripted, forcibly lynched, kidnapped off the streets, he compared all these kidnappings to human trafficking. So interesting, an Orthodox clergyman of the canonical church comparing the forced conscription and drafting of soldiers to human trafficking, very sort of powerful. And now he himself, this Archimandrite Bogdan, is now also being shipped off to a Ukrainian war camp to, of course, be forcibly recruited and sent to the trenches. Very, very sad. And I think the most striking story is, we speak about Patriarch Bartholomew on occasion. We try to go soft on him. We try to be as charitable as possible. I think that's true if you've listened to all our previous 8th-hour episodes, Conrad. But unfortunately, Patriarch Bartholomew is not charitable to himself as he digs his hole deeper and deeper. And in fact, at the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, which is held in Strasbourg, France, it's essentially the Palace of Europe. And just reading off of the Wikipedia, this is what this assembly even stands for. It stands for ending the death penalty, stands for promoting progressive policies across Europe, stands for improving liberty, democracy, promoting democracy in post-Soviet countries. So essentially, it's a big platform for the further demoralization and destruction of European peoples. Patriarch Bartholomew at this assembly gives this very bad accounting of the schism which has taken place, which he was essentially one of the creators of in 2018. And he states that the non-canonical church run by Metropolitan Epiphany Syria has been developing and has been maturing and uniting the Ukrainian people around itself. And the last 6 years since the Ukrainian Russian schism. This particular situation has been very good. He said that the OCU works in practice and not just in theory. So he says that all of our deep aspirations have been essentially approved, and history has shown that we've made the right decision by granting autocephaly to this schismatic Ukrainian church. So Patriarch Bartholomew essentially highlights his own mistake, and instead of backing off and admitting that, well, the OCU has participated in church seizures, the arrests of priests, all kinds of other crimes across, not just the SMO, but since 2018. He doesn't mention any of that. And to all these Europeans at the Palace of Europe in France, he announces that his idea of creating this schismatic Ukrainian church has been a great success, and that this will lead to the further development and unity of Ukrainian people, which we know is a lie because, as you've said, Conrad, in our 8th episode with Eric Stryker, nobody attends these schismatic churches in the first place. So Patriarch Bartholomew, unfortunately, just like Pope Francis, really, again, positioning himself as one of the enemies of orthodoxy in the world. And that's very sad because he is the ecumenical patriarch, the sort of appellant to whom clergymen can, I guess, canonically go to seek redress in case they're unfortunately mistried by their local churches. So his role, unfortunately, at the moment is being abused by he himself. And no one's forcing him to say these things. He's doing it himself. And that's one of probably the weirdest stories of the week. And yeah, we can't really ignore it. We have to really just say it as a fact and just proclaim it loudly so that nobody falls into illusions.
Patriarch Bartholomew, unfortunately, he's been given a million chances to denounce what has happened, to see the writing on the wall, to see the fruits, that have borne from the tree that he's planted. And time again, he has sided with the devil and has sided with the geopolitical machinations of Jewry. So unfortunately, we can just pray for him and hope that at this point, we hope he can just get out of power as soon as possible so he can stop causing so much damage to the church. But another thing that occurred, a video came from a village in Bukovina in Ukraine, where a bunch of canonical Orthodox Christians, their priests, the families, they stood in front of their church and basically gave a petition to J.D. Vance and Christians in the United States to protect them from the Banderite schismatics. And they recount how they've been attacked and been oppressed, and that these groups that are oppressing them are supported by the Zelensky government, and that all sorts of people that don't even go to their parish, they get these secret meetings and then vote to transfer the parish over to the schismatics without any consultation of the actual members of the parish or the priest or anybody. So be sure to pray for that and hope that J.D. Vance, he has actually spoken about the UOC, and Tucker Carlson has, I think, red-pilled him on the situation there and how Pompeo started all of that. So hopefully he can do something positive in that direction. But speaking of positive reunifications and endings of schisms, this is from Ortho Christian. Old Believer parishes in Alaska and Oregon join ROCOR. It goes on to say, Old Believer parishes in Alaska and Oregon are joining the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. His Grace, Bishop John of Caracas in South America, who ministers to ROCOR's Old Rite parishes, made an announcement concerning the new parishes during a visit to the Old Rite Church of the Nativity in Erie, Pennsylvania on January 26th. For decades, the Erie parish was the only canonical Old Rite church in ROCOR, previously of the priestless Old Believer tradition. Parish leader Pyman Simon, I don't know how to say the Pimen Russian name, but he led the congregation into the church in 1983 and was ordained as its first priest. In 2023, another Old Rite parish, Ascension of Christ Orthodox Church in Manette, Missouri, was received into ROCOR. Now with the new parishes in Alaska and Oregon, ROCOR has 4 canonical Old Rite parishes. It was previously reported in May 2023 that Father Nikolai and his parish were joining ROCOR, though their reception was delayed. However, Father Nikolai has now been received into the church. We have people from Alaska and Oregon who are coming into our fold, Bishop John said. Yesterday, I chrismated Father Nikolai and Father Nikita. Father Nikolai serves in Alaska along with his Matushka, and Father Nikita is in Oregon. With his Matushka, they were also chrismated. Both Father Nikolai and Father Nikita were priests of the Belo-Krinitskaya hierarchy. However, they were received as laymen and are being ordained in the canonical church. On Sunday, both were raised through the ranks of candlebearer, reader, and subdeacon, and Father Nikolai was further ordained to the diaconate. On Tuesday, he was ordained to the priesthood, and Father Nikita to the diaconate, with his ordination to the priesthood scheduled for this coming Sunday. So this is wonderful. Glory to God. I've heard a lot about some of these communities in Oregon. That's some of the biggest Old Believer communities in America, Alaska as well, of course, with its Orthodox heritage. So this is wonderful to see. Those that are in the Old Rite are obviously very traditional, and you can see the picture in this article. You can even see the Bishop John vested in his Old Rite, wares, which is, I think it's very awesome. I think they look very aesthetic. So, may the Old Rite grow across America. I know in Pennsylvania, I think there's also a Moscow Patriarchate Old Rite parish under the Edenoveris. So very cool things happening here. But as we end the show here, Dimitri, I think we had some recent multiple speeches, multiple incredible things said by Patriarch Kirill. Of course, in our interview with Stryker, I read the quote from Patriarch Kirill about how certain forces in the world are repeating like a mantra that Russia is a multi-confessional, multi-ethnic state to try to replace it from its Russian Orthodox roots, in which, of course, it really is a Russian Orthodox civilization state. But Patriarch Kirill, he's been saying a lot of good things recently, for sure.
Oh, no, absolutely. And this is a very powerful speech because you don't see hierarchs. I mean, compare Patriarch Kirill's speech in the Duma this week to Patriarch Bartholomew's speech in front of at the Palace of Europe. It's just diametrically opposed. Patriarch Bartholomew, of course, promoting sort of European values, and Patriarch Kirill speaking about the dangers of AI and, of course, the coming of the Antichrist and his use of globalism and globalization to further his control over the globe. And he spoke about essentially the threat of the Antichrist to the entire Russian parliament. You can see the Speaker of the Russian Duma very intently, sort of eyebrows raised, very sort of firm-faced, watching and listening to Patriarch Kirill. This is like the third most powerful man in Russia at the moment after the Prime Minister. And like all these serious Russian politicians, Deputy of the Duma, Tolstoy as well, sitting behind him, like just very intently listening as Patriarch Kirill lectures them about the coming of the Antichrist. I mean, it's very, very awesome and very much needed, especially with current events taking place around the world and us sort of heading headfirst into the Third World War, no one really stopping it. But the crux of the message of Patriarch Kirill was that essentially there are real dangers regarding AI. So he basically underlined everything we spoke about with Anthony of Westgate on our A4 episodes. Patriarch Kirill, I'm sure he's not a listener of the show, but if he was, I mean, glory to God. And he mentioned very clearly that AI should be used very pragmatically, and humans should always keep very strong control over it. Do not let AI sort of benefit the Antichrist, benefit his servants, and push the world into this globalist agenda. He said that AI is incredibly dangerous, and we should be very wary about how we use it. So a very interesting speech, and he spoke about the Antichrist very importantly as an evil person, as this, not just this amorphous, ambiguous mass or some sort of movement, but the Antichrist is a particular person who will come to power during the end times eschatologically, and he will rule, if not the entire world, a very large portion of it. And many people, especially who fall away from Christ, will bow down to him. And it's a dire warning given to, well, you can say some of the most powerful Russian people in the Duma. I mean, Putin wasn't there, but I'm sure he was listening. So it's great that Patriarch Kirill is again pushing. Just recently, every speech is given over the last year in 2025 has been very much on the nose and very much in the stream of what this show is about and what kind of warnings and some of the predictions regarding world affairs that we give here. So super important stuff.
No, really great stuff. Patriarch Kirill has really been proving himself a very civilizational and orthodox and even saintly leader. Of course, we don't love his comments about Darwinism. We don't love that he occasionally says nice things about Patriarch Sergius from the Soviet era. But besides that, I really don't have many complaints about Patriarch Kirill at all. And again, we hope that ROKOR and the Moscow Patriarchate can continue to merge into a common culture, taking the best from the white Russian emigres in ROKOR, as well as the best from those that were fostered in the catacomb church and those, like Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, those that suffered within the canonical church, within the post-Sergian church under the later Soviet Union at places like the Skov Caves Monastery and others. But with all of that, I want to ask everybody to keep the victims of these plane crashes in the United States in your prayers. We're seeing more footage from the Philadelphia crash, and people on the ground have been burned and maimed, and I expect the casualty count to increase. And just in general, crazy things are happening across the world and in my home country here of the United States. So please keep all of that in your prayers. All Americans, please keep our homeland, our leaders, our bishops, especially in your prayers and all of that. So with all of that, thank you all so much for listening. This has been quite an extensive episode. Again, be sure to listen to our Ether Hour episode with Joseph Jordan, Eric Stryker. It's really good stuff. It's going to be linked down below. Be sure to join the World War Now Discord as well, and the World War Now Substack. Obviously, that is our home base, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. You can find all of our content there. Please, please, please get behind the paywall and support us. You get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes. You get access to all of our Q&As. And in the future, you'll have access to all Q&A threads. You'll also get access to the exclusive subscriber-only channels on our Discord, the World War Now Discord server, which is very active every day. We have all sorts of people in there. All of our show guests are in there. There's priests in there to ask questions and whatnot. So please join our community over there. Be sure to follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. I'm getting closer and closer to 10,000 subscribers, so please do what you can. Help me on that journey. Give me a follow. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on YouTube. The World War Now YouTube channel is getting closer to 5,000 subscribers, so follow us there. I plan some live streams that will be coming up very shortly. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That is our 24/7 news feed where we really do a lot of our research, so be sure to follow us there. And with all of that, that's all of our stuff, worldwarnow.co. Like I said, thank you to the paid subscribers for keeping all of this possible. And like the video, like I said, YouTube, Substack, Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you are listening, please, please, please like the video, leave a comment, let us know what you thought. We love hearing from you. And with all of that, I will leave you with the last words, Dimitri.
Yeah, no, thank you everyone for listening. I hope you all have a great week, and a special thank you to all the paid subscribers and all those who spread, like, retweet all of our content across all the platforms, in particular, of course, YouTube, which is very oppressive in its algorithm, and Substack. Thank you for making this show happen, and we appreciate your support. Join the Discord, very important, as Conrad said, because we will be having some interesting discussions over the next week. Perhaps me and Conrad will join some of the voice channels and we'll be talking to some of you. So definitely get involved with us, and I'm sure it'll be productive both ways. So have a great week, guys.
God bless y'all.